you look at equitable transportation, equitable urban transportation systems. So what are some of the major indicators of a transportation system achieving equity in African cities that you look at?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I'm interested in transportation, and one of the issues that we look at is, well, we're interested in is the issue of equity. And in general, in a very broad brushstroke, if you look at the kind of transportation situation on the continent, in terms of user experiences, it almost maps almost exactly in terms of the demographic profile of the person in transit and the experience. So in general, the worse off in the social hierarchy, the worse off the mobility experience. So children, the working class, the poor, women generally, their mobility experiences from, in transit from going to home to work are very poor. Whereas on the other hand, it's generally the case that they're more well off in terms of income, are able to enjoy, private mobility, so the use of cars, luxury cars and so on. But also even on the train experience. In Johannesburg, where I'm based, there's now a very nice high-speed train, but almost equivalent to what you might see in Western Europe or in the United States, for instance, that travels up, at speeds of up to 120 kilometers per hour. But it's a very expensive to use it. So it's mainly, again, the middle class who are able to use this, or unless a working class person is subsidized. So in general, again, this is kind of a broad brushstroke experience. Sure. Because in Addis Ababa, for instance, there's a very new light rail that has just been constructed. While it's a very comfortable, clean, efficient service, unlike the Johannesburg experience, it's also affordable and accessible to the working class. So it's not expensive. I'm giving a broad picture. So the inequity broadly maps onto the demographic profile.
What is it like in your research when you look at how it falls on racial lines? Is there still, given the history, you're a historian, of apartheid and segregation, is that still, does class and race and gender still line up, or does it line up at all when you look at the inequity of access to transportation in cities in Africa?
Yeah, this has always been my interest, and this is actually the motivation for the research network that I told you that we're putting together, is trying to understand or analyze to what extent do the contemporary experiences, perhaps as I was describing to you, have to do with the past. So what we're seeing, again, is in general terms, it is the case that this kind of inequity in terms of race, class, continues. So again, speaking, again, I really don't want to generalize. Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is an enormous continent with enormous diversity. So I'll just speak about the South African experience, or even the Johannesburg experience. It is the case that the kind of racial legacy where the Black African population or the subordinated populations under colonialism and then apartheid, yes, do continue to have the worst off mobility experience. So there's definitely that kind of continuation of these practices that were established some time ago. But on the other hand, there's also been some advancements and some changes. So when I speak about this kind of high-speed train that has come onto Johannesburg, it's also the case that it's being enjoyed by Black emerging middle classes, for instance. It's also the case that, again, the upper class Black population then is increasingly able to afford private mobility, private cars, and so on. So yes, in general, there is a continuation of the history of inequity that comes from the experience of colonialism and apartheid, but there are some ways in which this is really beginning to change. And I suppose our expectation is that you'd have that overall transformation going forward.
So you're launching this research group. Tell us about the kind of the gaps in research on urban mobility that you are hoping to address through this research group.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think what is evident, what was evident in kind of scanning the scholarship so far on urban mobility in Africa, it became very clear that there's an enormous amount of scholarship, um, whether it's based, situated in different disciplines, whether it's kind of engineers, whether it's sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists, and so on, who are looking at the mobility experience. Um, there's a often their kind of temporal lens is very contemporary. And so there was a very limited sense of this kind of scholarship really looking at the ways in which sort of engineering practices or looking at questions of stigma that we've been talking about might have a longer temporal trajectory. So there's been very limited historical scholarship that is looking at or trying to understand contemporary practices from a historical lens. So one of the objectives of the research network is really to invite um, existing and emerging scholars to bring a historical lens to contemporary practices, because it is my view, and I think it is my colleagues' view, that we're collaborating in the network. I think by really beginning to understand um, the kind of historical origins of infrastructure planning, historical origins of town planning, historical origins of stigma, and so on, then we really can begin to disrupt and create new sustainable trajectories. In the South African experience, and I think in the African experience, for instance, so I've been telling you about how there's very limited investment for walking, even
Yeah.
though in very many urban contexts, a lot of people are walking. I think it's almost become taken for granted that that's just how urban policy, urban transportation policy is done. So we don't allocate for infrastructure. The citizens often do not question this kind of state of situation, this state of things. And I think one of the benefits of doing this kind of historical research is to, I guess, in a sense, is to provide a wake-up call by showing that things have not always been like this, even though in the contemporary situation we may take it for granted. So in my own work, where I sought to understand the history of cycling in Johannesburg, um, uh, I have sought to show that in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, cycling was a very prolific practice for all social groups, for the wealthy, for the working class. But in the contemporary situation in Johannesburg, in terms of everyday mobility, it's become a practice for the working class and the poor. And so it's part of the exercise is to understand how does that situation arise historically, and then by understanding that, it's one is almost providing a recipe for the possible transformation trajectory, but also really showing that there's nothing intrinsic about particular context that makes it impossible to allocate for walking and cycling infrastructure.